Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 22nd chapter of the first book in Chronicles. The chapter which comes before it, the 21st, begins with David doing Satan's bidding without even knowing it. The idea that he got was to conduct a census of his military personnel. He wanted to have a complete census of his entire nation of able-bodied men whom he could enlist in service for military if necessary. And Job, his general, resists and protests, but he does do it when the king's word prevails against his own, and the resentment is stoked up by the time he gets to the tribe of Levi and Benjamin. The reasons that commoners would have resented census is because they knew that they were being conscripted for a foreign war, or they could expect heavy taxes imposed. But more importantly, it is evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So he punishes Israel, the nation, for David's sin. And as it boils down to him, he gives him three options to choose from, each of which are covenantal curses that were promised in response to their disobedience. One was a famine, the other was to be militarily at the mercy of their armies, both for a period of 3 years, or even the sword of Yahweh, the angel of death, coming through and smiting a significant chunk of Israel. And David can't even choose these ones. He's just worried about falling into the hands of Yahweh and leaning on his mercy and not falling into the hands of man. So what Yahweh chooses is the angel of death. This is the quickest, this is the most painless, the least longest lasting. But 70,000 men die in the course of 3 days. And these men were in all likelihood not innocents. They may have joined Absalom's rebellion, which is not mentioned in the Chronicles accounts because the Chronicles is a whitewashing. It presents David and Solomon as messianic portents. But this sin is included because it's providentially arranged. Verse 15, and Elohim sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, Yahweh saw and relented about the evil, and said to the angel who was destroying, enough, now stop your hand. And the angel of Yahweh was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Elohim meant business. He had the angel of death with his sword unsheathed, ready to swing and wipe out the entire land of Israel on account of its king's waywardness and wickedness. And why was this idea so wrong? It's because he did not have permission. He took it on his own initiative. He was doing Satan's bidding without even knowing it. But he relents, so he is sovereign, and he has the power to judge or intervene and spare people of promised judgment, and he does handcuff the sword in the hand of his angel of death, and the place that he does it at is a specific location, the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. The Jebusites would have been the aboriginal inhabitants of Jerusalem, which David conquered and made his capital city, and the threshing floor is a similar place of meeting between an angel. Where do we find him approaching Gideon in the 6th chapter of Judges on a threshing floor? So he in the 17th verse, he just says, why is this punishment coming on them? It is something I have done. I have sinned, punish me. And so he has the heart of a shepherd. When the 18th verse, it reads, and the angel of Yahweh commanded Gad to say to David that David should go up to raise an altar of Yahweh on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Gad was David's prophets, one of them, and he was the intermediary in the dialogue between David and divinity. So he was the one to whom Yahweh spoke through him, and he spoke through David. That was the order of operation. And he commands him to build an altar there because this is the place where he had relented on his resolve to wipe out Israel in the blink of an eye. And David obediently complies, and the Ornan, the owner of the property, Ornan, sees David, and he recognizes him as king, and he bows. That's what an inferior would do to a superior in the ancient world. Verse 22, and David said to Ornan, give me the site of the threshing floor so that I build an altar to Yahweh on it. Give it to me at the complete price, so that the plague is restrained from the people. David had plenty of wealth at his disposal, but he was not seeking a bargain. He was not motivated by the best bargain available, the emergency of the situation. He was given this command through his prophet, which had been given from the angel of Yahweh, who got it from Yahweh himself. So the urgency of the prophecy is just, whatever you want, whatever you ask for it. And Ornan says, he does not resist the king. He does not prize his personal property. He sees that the king is on business and there's an urgency, a plague that has afflicted Jerusalem. So he gives it all in verse 24. And King David said to Ornan, "No, but I shall certainly buy it at the complete price, for I do not take what is yours for Yahweh, nor a burnt offering without cost." Ornan is a generous man. He's willing to lend things for the sacrifice, but David insists adamantly so on just bearing the full financial responsibility for the consequence that he was burdened with. So, and he gives him, plenty of gold for the threshing floor. He does not shortchange him. And David built there an altar to Yahweh, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called on Yahweh, and he answered him from the heavens by fire on the altar of burnt offerings. So David has an occasion and an appearance and an audience with Yahweh himself after doing what he had done, what Yahweh had told his prophet to tell David to do. He did it, and then not long after doing it, immediately after building the offer and offering the sacrifices, he has this dialogue that is sent in the form of a fire. And then Yahweh commanded the angel and returned his sword to his sheath. So the punishment was stayed, the destruction was averted, because Yahweh saw that David he meant business about his repentance. He knew that he had done wrong, and he felt terrible about the punishment and the plague that was coming on his people. Remember, they may not have been entirely innocent, but David still has the mind and mentality of a shepherd. It breaks his heart to see his people suffering for his own sin when he knew he knew what he was doing was wrong. Verse 28 and 29. At that time, when David saw that Yahweh had answered him on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there for the temple of Yahweh, and the altar of the burnt offering which Moses had made in the wilderness were at the time at the high place in Gibeon. So David purchases this property, and it is revealed to him that this is to be the site and location of the temple. This was located on Mount Zion, Mount Menorah, Mount Moriah, the same place that Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, had been sent to sacrifice his own son. And Abraham is a model of unquestioning obedience. And then the author of the Hebrews has an interesting perspective that he was willing to lay his son down on the line with faith in the resurrection. But in any case, the things that was not Moses who made the tabernacle in the wilderness generation. That was he received the blueprint for the design, but he had an architect, and the architect relied on plenty of builders to build it. But in any case, it had not been a stationary location. It was moved in a tent, but its impermanent resting place right now is Gibeon, and that is the place where Solomon offers sacrifices, and then he is visited in a dream in response to his obedient actions. 22nd chapter, 1st verse. David then said, "This is the house of Yahweh Elohim, and this is the altar of burnt offerings for Israel." So the place that Gibeon was at, David was currently unable to go to because he had reason to fear the sword of the angel. So he didn't want to move there. He just wanted to make all the preparations right there where it was needed. He had the revelation. He was a man of action. And so he gets busy immediately. Now, he had been told that he was not to be the one to build the temple, but David does all that he can to build it without actually building it. He gathers the materials and the whole organizational apparatus. In the Chronicles accounts, it's really David sets in motion what Solomon is able to build on, and he wanted to be the one who would build it above all else. This was his deepest desire, but he obediently complied with the rejection of his request, in no small part because Yahweh's promise to him was greater than anything he could even think to offer him, dynasty and perpetuity. And David commanded to gather the foreigners who were in the land of Israel, and he appointed stonemasons to cut hewn stone to build the house of Elohim. So the conscripted people, these were not quite slaves. These were not, neither were they fully employees nor free men. They were conscripted laborers, probably paid a measly sum, but the point is they had no, they were completely coerced and forced into doing the bidding. And the reason that they were was because they were not native Israelites. The Israelites had known what it was like to be a foreigner in a strange land in Egypt, and they were commanded to treat them better than the Egyptians treated them. And they are not quite enslaving these people, but they are conscripting them for no greater crime than to be a foreigner dwelling in Israel. They were commanded to genocide these people in actual fact, but some of them left over, and the generations have to linger with them. But they had a inferior social status that the king could exploit at will, and that's what he does here. Now Gentiles are certainly part of the process of the building, and one of the purposes for which the temple was built was to draw the Gentiles into Jerusalem. But also the Phoenician architect that Solomon relied on was a Gentile, and they're certainly part of this process here too. And David prepared large quantities of iron for the nails of the doors of the gates and for the clamps, and more bronze than could be weighed. He spared no expense. The bronze that could not be weighed, that is bronze on a kingly royal scale. So when they say it could not be weighed in one sitting, they were probably correct. This would have been an expensive endeavor, which would have demanded design, preparation, and execution, and plenty of physical muscle to build all this stuff. So the nails would have been part of the process, and the clamps, and the bronze is what paid for it all. And the bronze was to be adorned in the physical structure in the interior. And cedar trees beyond number for the Zidonians, and those from Zor brought much cedar wood to David. Zor and Zidonians, now this city would have been to the north, the neighboring country of Lebanon, whose unique prized possession was the possession of cedar trees. This is what David's palace was made of, and this excellent wood, is great for building. It just has a luxurious aura to its look, and it would have been quite the commodity in the commercial transaction. But David was prudent enough to invest in the friendship of Hiram, who sustained his friendship with King Solomon, his son. So he was younger than David, but older than Solomon, and he is an instrumental figure in the construction of the temple. And David said, Solomon, my son, is young and tender, and the house that is to be built for Yahweh is to be exceedingly great, for a splendid name to all the lands. Please let me make preparation for it. So David made extensive preparation before his death. Solomon acknowledged at much that he was young and tender. He did this when he was 19 years old, having recently ascended to the throne. He is visited at a sacrifice in Gibeon. There's thousands of animals slaughtered at this occasion. And he is visited in the night, and when he is given on a golden platter his innermost heart's desire, he says, I am young and experienced, and he has just the overwhelming sense of the magnitude of the people. These people are as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and I am but a wee lad. I have no experience. Give me wisdom. And so the idea that Solomon was not wise to begin with is invalidated by the request that he be wise. He recognized his lack of wisdom, and that is where the humility that accompanies wisdom always goes. But here David has the same mindset of the dichotomy between the temple and the temple builder, and Solomon has the opposite acknowledgement of just the idea that this temple of four worlds built by the hands of man can contain the king of the cosmos and the heavens and the earth, in places such as 2 Chronicles 2:6 and 1 Kings 8:27. But the point and purpose of this temple was to bring the Gentiles to Jerusalem for the magnificence of Yahweh. So that's why they were fulfilling their Abrahamic evangelical mandate in building this, because it was a witness of the awesomeness and majesty. So David did all he could. Remember, he is not allowed to build it. He is obedient, but he does take the extensive preparation. His heart is in it. His mind is in it. This gives him something to do in the twilight of his reign. He also called for his son Solomon and commanded him to build a house for Yahweh Elohim of Israel. He had been told as much by Yahweh in the 17th chapter that, the son that you have, he doesn't name the son, but Solomon is the named successor in the Chronicles account. Now, in the King's account, he is not. It opens with Adoniah, the younger brother of Absalom, who himself tried to seize the throne from David, tried to do the same thing to Solomon. Solomon is the designated heir, but David was lax in his duty in disciplining the son Adoniah, who took it upon himself to declare himself king before he was dead. So it's at the forceful intervention of Nathan the prophet that he publicly proclaims Solomon his king, and he does that in the 28th chapter in this book. But the contradiction is only apparent. Adoniah may have tried to seize the throne. Now, exactly how public this was, he was doing it. He was, bidding his rebellion in a public occasion. But David may not have announced as clearly as is indicated in the Chronicles accounts. And the Chronicles accounts are very much a whitewashing, so I do believe that the King's accounts are better history, more historically accurate. This does not show the warts and all of a true biography. These two men, their warts and all, are exposed in the Samuels and in the First King accounts, respectively, but the Chronicle does not do it. And David said to Solomon, "My son, as for me, it has been in my heart to build a house to the name of Yahweh, my Elohim." It was in his heart because he was a man after God's own heart. He had a passionate longing and intense desire to do the will and just a drive to. He was a man with the mind after God. He wrote poems to him that are still model prayers. We read them throughout the book of Psalms, and also in the 16th chapter of First Chronicles we get a taste of his poetic magnificence. But he was not the one, and the reasons are explained, which opens the question of whether David received this revelation from his prophet or himself. "But the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have fought great battles. You do not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my presence." So in the King's account, I believe the 5th chapter, 3rd verse, Solomon says that the reason why his father was unable to do it because he was distracted at war. Here the chronicler's emphasis is theological and priestly. He's writing from the priestly perspective. So the amount of blood that David had shed ceremonially defiled him in a sense, and therefore disqualified him from being the one. The hands that had shed so much blood could not be the hands that built the temple. But there was nothing unethical. They were God-blessed and God-sanctioned wars. He waged these righteously and in the strength and the power and with the blessing of the Almighty. And he was a man after his own heart. And the secret to David's greatness was not David, but the God who walked with him and just enabled him to slay lions and bears from a tender young age, and then slay the giant Goliath himself, and then just vanquish all of Israel's foes, just consistent continuum of military victories. "See, a son is to be born of you, who is a man of rest, and I shall give him rest from his enemies all around, for Solomon is his name, and peace and rest I give to Israel in his days." Solomon's name, the prefix of it, Salam, is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which translates as peace, but peace is not an adequate enough translation. It does not do it justice. It does not convey the positive dimensions of the spiritual and temporal serenity and success that the shalom state of mind brings. But the other name, Man, is abbreviated from Manuka. So that word is alternately translated as quiet, but here is rest. So his reign was to be one of rest and peace. So the constant motion of always being at war to, the enemies would be vanquished. They would be silenced into submission by David, and then Solomon would work his diplomatic magic on them. And that's how Israel's geopolitical stance advanced beyond its highest hegemonic levels under these two men. But this Now, in Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, Solomon writes that there is a time for war and a time for peace, and his reign coincided with the time that Israel was to be at peace. David was the right king for the right time, but he wasn't the right one to be the one to build it. Solomon was the man with the wisdom to do it. He builds a house for my name, and he is to be my son, and I am to be his father, and I shall establish the throne of his reign over Israel forever. When the chronicler was writing this, a descendant of David and Solomon had ceased to sit on the throne of Jerusalem. There was no throne of Jerusalem. The Babylonians had wiped it out of existence, along with the temple itself that had been built by Solomon. But the reason, remember, his emphasis is Christological and messianic in orientation. So he's pointing to and alluding to the Messiah to come, and they have this hope. He records the promise in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. There was no descendant of David or Solomon sitting on the throne. There was no throne to speak of or to sit on. But, the ultimate fulfillment would be in the biological descendant of David, technically, because on his father's side he is descended from Solomon, but remember, Joshua does not bear any genetic material, and from his mother's side he is descended from David through Nathan, a different son. But he is the fulfillment. He was the eternal king. He rules forever. He springs from eternity, and there is no moment in time in which his sovereignty does not reign. Now, my son, Yahweh be with you. Then you shall prosper and build the house of Yahweh your Elohim, as he has said to you. So Yahweh with him, there is no obstacle he cannot overcome, or no task he cannot accomplish. The building and construction of the temple would have been a sacred responsibility. This was the prerogative of kings, and Israel was just being established, its monarchy. So they had a sight to behold and this temple to be built. But as long as Yahweh was with him, he would prosper, and Israel would prosper. The bounty of its wealth, archaeological evidence suggests that the accounts of the influx of wealth in the Bible are not exaggerated. So money was pouring in as it never did before or ever would be again in the land of Israel under Solomon's rule. So he did prosper. He did successfully complete the task. He did successfully reign. He did successfully advance his nation's interest through commerce and diplomacy. Only let Yahweh give you wisdom and understanding, and command you concerning Israel, so that you keep the Torah of Yahweh your Elohim. This is precisely what Solomon asks when he is given a blank slate, anything you want, his deepest desire. Now let's compare, for the sake of comparison, the deepest desire of David. It was to be the one to build the temple. Solomon was attached to this burden and responsibility. He knew he lacked the wisdom and experience in himself, so he was not unwise to begin with. He asked for the right thing and received that which he did not ask for, in addition to what he did ask for in superhuman abundance, just like wisest man and wealthiest man ever. But the king, as much as the commoner in Israel, remained bound by the law of Moses. They were commanded to carry a portable copy with them at all times, and Solomon got away from that towards the end of his life, though you'll never learn that from reading the Chronicles account. The Chronicles account ends with his the magnificent display of his wisdom in the presence and company of the Queen of Sheba, but there's no equivalent of the 11th verse. That's when you read 11th chapter in 1 Kings, when you read of Solomon's tragic idolatry-induced downfall and the consequent splitting of the kingdom. Then you shall prosper if you keep to do the laws and just judgments which Yahweh commanded Moses concerning Israel. Be strong and brave. Do not fear nor be discouraged. Solomon also had attached, what he didn't ask for was longevity of life, but he got that, but that was the only conditional one. He was given wealth, wisdom, and prestige without conditions, but he also had that which he did not ask for, the longevity of life, contingent on his obedience. So he did prosper for many years as a God-fearing, God-obeying king, but he got away towards it in the end. And these commandments, they're called the laws of Moses, but Moses is the mere human messenger. They really are the laws of Yahweh that are commanded to Moses, and through him the entire nation of Israel, the king as much as the commoner. And to be strong and brave. Now this sounds identical to what we read in what Moses tells his successor Joshua in and Joshua tells the nation of Israel. So what we have now, when Joshua was declared Moses' successor, it was first in private, then in public. We witnessed something similar in Solomon here. No one's present. It's not till the 28th chapter that he is publicly proclaimed his successor. See, in my affliction I have prepared for the house of Yahweh 100,000 kikers of gold, and 1,000,000 kikers of silver, and bronze and iron beyond measure, for it is plenty. And I have prepared timber and stone, and you shall add to them. He spared no expense, and he did everything he needed to do in order to complete the project. This was an expensive endeavor, but David, he was a wealthy king, certainly not as wealthy as Solomon. So Solomon's wealth just accumulated even after, he built this thing when he was 30 years old. So after that, he just kept, gaining wisdom and wealth for until he cut his life short prematurely at the age of 59. But David, once more, he was totally in the task of preparation. He took this seriously. He approached it diligently, and this is a fitting way for the king to spend his years. So this sin in the 21st chapter, that is where the Samuel account concludes. But in between, we have this chunk that we read only in Chronicles of the preparations that David made for the temple. And then David dies, of course, in the second chapter of 1 Kings. He's in the first as well. And with you there are many workmen, hewers and workers of stone and timber, and all types of skilled men for every kind of work. Solomon did, in the king's account, he conscripted the foreigners. He, raised up this involuntary workforce of the foreigners who were residing, the non-native Israelites. He made them work, but here it is presented as an inheritance that had been passed down from David. Of gold and silver and bronze and iron there is no limit. Rise up and do, and Yahweh is with you. So he has the assurance that he's going to all the money is already there. He's collected the sum total of the project, and Yahweh will be with you if you are on his will and doing his task and obeying. The king, as much as the commoner, had to obey. And David commanded all the rulers of Israel to help Solomon his son. So he enlisted the future organization. He invested in the organization of his son. He commanded all the rulers, the tribal patriarchs, just the men of prominence and position in Israel. They were to be at his son's bidding when David died. This is what he's doing before he dies. Is not Yahweh your Elohim with you, and he's not given you rest all around? For he has given the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land has been subdued before Yahweh and before his people. So the assurance of the presence and the power and the strength and the might of Yahweh just makes any a task achievable. He is the one who had pacified Israel's enemies by the hand of David, his servant, his warrior king. And, David also conscripted the non-Israelites for Solomon's service. That was set in motion as an inheritance. But the entire land was under the command and control of a king firmly seated on a throne in established city of Jerusalem. And now give your heart and your being to seek Yahweh your Elohim, and rise up and build the temple of Yahweh Elohim, to bring the ark of the covenant of Yahweh and the sacred vessels of Elohim into the house that is to be built for the name of Yahweh. So this is his instructions, his advice on his way out to his son. You just invite all your faculties and all their capacities, wholeheartedness to seeking Yahweh, and seek and you shall find. But if you sin and you seek, you're not going to find. So sin is a barrier which prevents the finding. Everyone's in pursuit of God, but their sins, they cannot approach God on their own terms. But he's charging and summoning his son to be the one to build, be the one to fulfill his heart's desire. Now, David had the promise of this, but he didn't have the vision. He was given the promise that the temple would be built, though he would not live to lay the first brick. His son would do the task that was his inner heart's longing, and the Ark of the Covenant would at last have a home even more magnificent than David's palace, although Solomon's did take 13 years to build his own palace and only 7 for the temple, but that's because he would have been distracted by the temple building. That's where he gave the greater priority. And just move everything, every item, precious item, every sacrosanct object that would have been at the tabernacle, it's going to be moved, and everything, the whole design is going to be in a temple rather than a tent. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.